right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 177 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I have my returning special guest, Christine Lynn. She is a historian and geopolitical analyst, and she's streaming live from Colorado. It's probably the frozen tundra of Colorado, and it's about 10:30 a.m. there, Christine.
Yes, it is. Surprisingly, a warm day today.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I'm here on the West Coast. It's about 50 degrees, not too bad. We have a special Christmas episode because it's probably going to be our last one before Christmas. And it's provocatively titled, Was Stalin a Christian? And this is a topic we're going to be discussing today, but it's a big topic. And the basic initial question I have, Christine, for you is it possible to be a communist as well as a Christian?
Well, that answer is yes. And the reason I say that is both historically and logically and personally. They coincide strongly, ethically, concern for the poor, concern for the exploited, the oppressed, and also a fundamental to both is justice. I would like your listeners to know that there were many actually Christian Bolsheviks in the hierarchy of the government as well. And of course, Bolshevism was not a Christian movement. However, Russia, the Soviet Union, as it is today, is an Orthodox Christian nation. And a lot of listeners, I know in the United States, don't even know what we're referring to when we talk about Orthodox Christian. It is the original Christian church. It is the Apostolic Church. And all the other denominations that we have in the United States, from the Catholics and the Protestants, all emanated. So when we say Orthodox Christianity, it is just the original Christian church. There were also a lot of Christian priests, Orthodox Christian priests, who supported the Bolsheviks. It was really common to hear at the time many phrases that became, I would say, culturally and socially in the Soviet Union at the time, and at the time of the revolution. It was very common that they had, I found so many common. Christ was the first socialist. Now, these are from 1917 to 1924. This is among both the peasants as well as the Bolshevik soldiers. We are building the kingdom of God on earth, but without the priest. Now, without the priest is fundamental to our discussion. The reason why there was such a anti in terms of the church was because the church was the institution that was really exploiting the people. But of course, one can be both. I am both a communist and support what Stalin beautifully accomplished. And it's not just me. There are plenty in Russia who are both Orthodox Christians and also supporters or appreciators of the Bolsheviks. I would say that really Marxism, for me, is applied Christianity. Now, Lenin was very clear, it didn't come from a Christian basis, but they didn't exclude it. And I would remind everybody that even Lenin's wife expressed much appreciation for Christian ethics. The first Commissar of Enlightenment, Lunacharsky, he would talk about a God-building movement. There were differences among the Bolsheviks. Of course, there were those who were atheist, but there were also many who it turned out to be had been raised as Christians and continued in their Christianity. The foundations, of course, differ. And Lenin made that very clear because theirs was a scientific basis. Nevertheless, I always say truth is where you find it. So historically, there have always been communists who were Christians. Logically, they are not mutually exclusive. And personally, for myself and many others worldwide who are both socialist, communist, and Marxist-Leninism are also Christians. And so, yes, it's like the same desired outcome, and yet theirs was based on scientific observation and analysis. And as I said, truth is where you find it, and they are not at all mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they are quite a perfect coincidence. I would also say, I'll give an analogy. One can be a Christian, but you can also learn completely, if you're into astronomy, from an atheist astronomer. It really makes no difference in that regard. And in my research, I found so many. I just have lists here of Bolshevik officials and hierarchy who frequently used Christian vernacular in their speeches, in their writings, in their political debate. And there's also numerous soldiers and generals who often were Orthodox and even discussed that, and we will get to more of that later, with Stalin, and that it was okay to have that. And he always encouraged whatever your faith was, that was private. Lenin was the same. They basically, Marx and Lenin opposed religion as an institution of power, but not the ethics of Christianity.
So the into feudalism, and feudalism was a system where you had hereditary monarchy in a coalition with the organized religion, and that was like the ruling class, right? The ruling class was like a royal family, and they had the support and backing of the church, and that was feudalism, and that gave way to what we know today as capitalism or liberalism. But why do you think so many people kind of do equate these things as opposites, and argue and believe that communism is opposed to and goes against religion, is opposed to religion? Like where does that come from, do you think?
I think it is a lack of knowledge even about Lenin and Marx. They only take the idea, and they may have their personal beliefs. Again, you could be a Christian, you could be an atheist and be a communist. But because they know that Lenin was an atheist, then they think that that is fundamental and that the two cannot coexist. But what they're forgetting or are unaware of is Lenin frequently acknowledged, Marx did as well, Engels, even more than either of those two, acknowledged the values of Christianity as being very important, because fundamentally, and Lenin recognized this, he just did not want the crossover for people to identify that communism, emanated from Christianity, because it did not. And that was what he was very strong about. And I think people, though, ignore the fact that Lenin and Marx, and particularly if you read Engels, acknowledged the fact that religion at the time served to help the people and comfort dealing with the feudalism. I mean, under the Tsar, over 80% were living in dire poverty. And of course, the anti-church that we saw actions, especially in the 20s, was a result of the fact that the church aligned itself with the whites. And that was completely clear in their mind. This was the enemy. So I think that they so much went against the institution of the church because it was exploitation. Those were the classes. I mean, many in the church hierarchy lived like nobility. And so I think people today know that part, but they don't understand the other part, that none of the Bolshevik leaders that, we learn from condemned the Christians. Instead, I think of, the quote, and in regards to comparing it to opium at the time. And Christians, it's interesting what you said, Christians get very upset when anyone such as myself or others share about Stalin's Christianity and the Christianity of the Bolsheviks, but also at the same time, communists get very upset. And I see that as ironical. Instead of understanding that we can coexist if we both agree upon those fundamentals. I think that Lenin very much saw the people as being oppressed. That is why he condemned the religion as an institution, because when people are hurting and in pain and suffering, they look to someone to give them some kind of hope. The church did that, but what they didn't realize, as frankly many don't these days, that it was exploiting them, and the Bolsheviks wanted to expose that. But I think it's just a misunderstanding and an ignorance of the fact that they were not anti the search the soul has for meaning and understanding and justice in this life. They just wanted to approach it from a scientific basis, fundamentally. And if you happen to be Christian and you agree, that as well, you can actually join them. But I think it's really the same. And Lenin saw that. He just saw it was the exploitation of those who were suffering. And I see it the same way today. They don't recognize the fact that you don't have to be a Christian and you can be a communist. You can be an atheist and you can be a communist. And it's just the inability to logically look at that.
I like what you said about, Christianity and communism being compatible and both being concerned with, taking care of the poor and, lessening exploitation and things like that. And I think that insofar as Christianity, really maintains and is focused on that, central premise, it's entirely compatible with, and it completely tolerated by, communist governments. So even actual existing communist governments have always tolerated organized religions. I think Catholicism, I want to say, is growing fastest in China today than anywhere else. And as long as, they're not being used as political institutions to, propagandize and indoctrinate the people into overthrowing the government, they're perfectly fine and tolerated. And I think that, generally speaking, this misperception of why these two aren't compatible is because they have been exploited by the ownership class. They've always utilized religion and tried to exploit religion, manipulate religion in order to serve their own, class interests, their own ruling class interests. And so, you have to deal with that if you're a government that, is not interested in exploiting, is genuinely concerned in the welfare of the people. You have to make sure that, religion isn't weaponized against you by, the outside forces and internal forces that are more than happy to do that. So I have this next question, Christine. So Marx and Lenin, again, they're, assumed to be anti-religion, and they may have been atheists. It's tough for me to think of anybody as a real atheist, just because, like, how could anybody have certainty of where humanity came from? So for instance, I consider myself an agnostic. I have no certainty, if there is any kind of eternal being, creator person. But to think that it all just happened from nothing, everything just came from nothing, and that's also tough to believe. So, so it's hard for me to think that anybody is a real atheist, that anybody has certainty that everything just spontaneously came from nothing somehow. Like that's a tough sell for me. And so I prefer to just call myself agnostic. I'm never really going to know. And I'm okay with that. But, people that have certainty in atheism are perplexing to me. But so Marx and Lenin, Marx, I believe it was Marx, said, there's a quote that people are always using. It's, religion is the opioid of the masses. But if you take that quote in full, it's a little bit different. And so, but is that one reason why the West kind of has this misperception, because they take this one quote out of context?
Yeah, when Lenin referred to it as the opioid of the people, they take it out of context. You're entirely correct, and misrepresent it as if he was insulting or attacking Christianity. On the contrary, this is not an insult. If you put it in the historical perspective, at the time, opium was a medicine. It was meant to help you in whatever pain you were suffering, whatever ailment you were going through. It was intended to help comfort a person when they were ill. So his reference to religion as the opium of the people, opioid of the people, is saying that it serves to comfort the people. And yet, when he continues with the quote, he said, "This is the fact that people go for religion is a sign that they are oppressed." He said it is, the heart for them in a heartless world. So you continue with this and you see once again, it's Lenin's caring about the people and realizing that this class of people, they are again being exploited by giving them something to give them temporary comfort. But what the people did not know was that the very ones who are issuing this, and I tell you, at the time, it was just disgusting to see that they were exploited not only in the fact that they received tithes, but the hierarchy, church hierarchy, took fees for the sacraments, for Holy Communion, for funerals, for confession, even all of these. And they were the hierarchy, not necessarily all of those at the poor level or the village level, but the hierarchy of that church was living like nobility. And this is what he was speaking of. He never attacked religion. He simply attacked it as an institution of exploitation, not the values, not the yearning of the soul. Because they needed comfort. They were living in a terrible time under the Tsar, and the Bolsheviks wanted to change that, as they well did. I do think it's like you said, Billy Bob, Christians today take these things out of context. They've probably never read Marx or Lenin or Engels. They've probably never read from the collected works of Stalin. So they just pick and choose tiny little phrases out of an abundance of material in order to make their narrative. But their narrative falls flat when you take a look at all of those just mentioned, as well as many other Bolsheviks in the government. I would have to say that Orthodox Christianity has been the overall factor in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and the people. It did not have to be recognized, as it is now, as well as other religions in the Russian Federation, but it did not have to be recognized to be a fact. That is why I say, personally and logically, it is consistent to be a communist and a Christian, but historically so, most of them, or many of them, most certainly were. And as we'll get into Stalin's time, it became much more so. And that is what both Christians and communists do not seem to want to recognize. Unlike yourself, who is objective to, you're in your agnosticism, to recognize these are not inconsistent. For some reason, especially American communists and American Christians, including American Orthodox, they feel compelled to fight the other instead of to accept the fact if the values and the end result is the same. For myself as a Christian, I have never seen, when we talk about heaven on earth and living the teachings of Jesus Christ, I have never seen a society ever do that more than under Stalin and under Putin's Russian Federation. So I think it's fundamental to the Russian people.
And you mentioned Western Christians, and I think like most anti-communist narratives, it had its beginnings in the Red Scare and also the Cold War. And this idea of godless communism was really a way that the Western propagandists could reinforce this anti-communist indoctrination in people's minds, because Christianity, by and large, especially 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, was was a much bigger part of public life. It's only recently that not everybody's Christian, right? Like that's kind of a new thing. It's the trajectory that our country's going on. But to equate something with being anti-Christian was a great way to propagandize against it and indoctrinate people's minds against this idea and this ideology. So and then and what they would use as evidence and a basis for this idea that communism was opposed to religion and godless was a lot of what we've been talking about, because you had the organized religion that was opposed to the government. And so you had the hierarchy of the religion, like you said, siding with the whites during the Bolshevik Revolution or the Civil War. And what happened is when the Bolsheviks won, they did land reform, and then all of the vast amounts of land that were owned by the church were there's repossessed, but there's a more fancy term for expropriated. They were expropriated and redistributed. And so it's interesting that, for instance, this is a fact that I know. In 1991, after the Soviet Union dismantled itself, Poland, the Catholic Church once again became the biggest single landowner in all of Poland. So, with the victory of the Soviets in World War II, they expropriated and redistributed a lot of these Catholic land holdings. And then in 1991, when the new government came in, they took all the land back and gave it back to the Catholic Church. And now the Catholic Church is the single greatest landowner once again in the state of Poland. So that's just an idea. But so the West, would say that, well, look, they took all of these lands from the Catholic Church. That proves that they hate God. That's their argument. But it doesn't withstand scrutiny and it's not logical.
Well, they lack critical thinking skills. Yeah. And sadly, I'd have to say the majority of Americans lack critical thinking skills. It's unfortunate. In my speaking with people and audiences again and again, and I'm sure you experienced this, Americans have no idea, because of exactly what you said, the lying propaganda from their government to instill that fear in them, and thus their hatred of communism, which overlaps now into all of their Russophobia. I still meet Americans who think that Russia is, quote, a communist country. The degree of ignorance of Americans, willful ignorance, is astonishing. They do not know what communism is historically. They do not know what socialism is. I was speaking to someone just recently, and they were talking about how all the socialism in our country. And I am thinking, if only that which they call socialism and communism is not here, but they have the meaning that's been given to them, as you have well elucidated. In regards to the landowners, that's an excellent, sharing what happened in Poland. It's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, because as I said, the church was one of the largest landowners. Lots of the land and the churches, thousands of them, in fact, were either demolished. True. And that is sad when you think about the history of them, but it was a reaction at the time. And there were militant atheists, of course, especially, among the people. And again, the memory of the Civil War, and that these had been their enemy. But you also have to remember a lot of them were also repurposed. The country was growing. It was being built and really rebuilt for the first time. And as much as Christians today like to speak about the destruction, and we may get into a few of the details later, but I think it is relevant right now, so much of that was actually reversed by Stalin. He reopened over 15,000 to 22,000 churches. And to your point, Billy Bob, where there are Christians who try to say, and even communists who try to say he did this for political reasons. But no, he went far beyond anything that we can attribute to simply a political advantage like Western leaders do. 15,000 to 22,000 churches open, seminaries reopened, allowing all of the worship again. The number of things he did for the church went far beyond some nominal for any, quote, political advantage that I hear both communists and Christians accuse him of, because he was into complete restoration. He was reversing everything that was done prior to him, and he did this as he obviously as the leader and going through the war, had much more power, as general secretary and with the people, and eliminating really those who would be against this. He really wanted the freedom of the church, and he restored it all back to them. He even met with Patriarch Sergius. It's very interesting. So publicly, he did so much for the church, and the more power that he had, the more he was able to implement this, which is, to me, a clear sign of his character, but there were many others.
You mentioned he opened seminaries and he opened tens of thousands of churches. And didn't Stalin, in his younger years, he attended seminary, right?
Yes, he was actually, his mother was deeply spiritual Orthodox Christian, and he was raised as so, and his Christianity was very deep. He received it was so good when he went to the Gori school that he received a scholarship to the and was preparing to become a priest in his early life. Theologically, he was one of the most outstanding students at the seminary in Tbilisi at the time, Tbilisi now, and learned much scripture. He learned Church Slavonic. He was considered one of the best, if not the best, hymnist and church chanting. It was also during his young years here at seminary, preparing to become a priest. He was between the ages of 15 to 20 when he wrote his beautiful poetry. And anyone who has not sought out Stalin's poetry, you're very much missing. And I point that out not only because of the beauty regarding our life and our aging and the observation of suffering, but also a theme through it all, the love of the natural world and of divine providence. And you see that in his writings. His poetry was so extraordinary that when he submitted it to one of the top journals at the time, one of the most renowned poets of the time said, the quality, the literary quality was exceptional. And yet this was from his earliest poems at the age of 15 were being critiqued this way. The interesting thing when you bring up about him being in seminary, it was while he was in seminary that he discovered Marx and other revolutionary thinkers and literature. There were actually, let's call it, underground meetings. The seminary was extremely, in fact, Stalin later called it prison-like because he valued independent thought, and they did not allow for that. And he said it was that strictness which really led him and his desire when he found Marx and really pushed him into being a revolutionary, because he rejected the hypocrisy and anyone who would keep him from independent thought. And in fact, I remember a quote where he said, the monks don't like independent thought, and yet students such as himself would meet. And that is actually where he began his appreciation of Marx and became and decided not to become a priest. He said it was the strict regimen there. He never, as a man and as a leader, rejected or said anything, as other Bolshevik leaders have, but he never said anything against Christianity. And on the contrary, we have, I would have to say, almost countless personal anecdotes from diaries, letters, and memoirs of those who worked for him at his dacha. Those were his bodyguards, and I have about 4 of them that I have researched and listened to. that give many stories of his practice of Christianity as a leader, which we can get into some of that. But yes, it was in his early years that, his orthodoxy was formed. His mother always said, both when he was young and even when in much later years, when Stalin brought her to Moscow from Georgia, she always kept saying, to her son, she wished he had become a priest, and he recounted this several times to friends and those who saw it, and he would just comfort her and say, I know, mother. She always said that. So it was pretty interesting. I've done a lot of reading of Stalin, what he would write in the margins of books. Stalin had an extensive library, Billy Bob, thousands of books. And even with him, wherever he went, he frequently carried his reading material, many of which were Christian books. We know this from those who worked with him, as I said, but also his daughter, his sons, and others in the hierarchy, and many were Christian books. I've really found fascinating was to read his notes, the ones that survived from his library, and you can really see his deep thought about values and principles in this. He always, in fact, spoke frequently of Jesus with respect and of truth, and even with his children. We have quite a few interviews with them in which they spoke about, I think that it was his youngest son, Vasily, who said that, what was it? It was his youngest son, Vasily, who said that, I believe it was the youngest son, said that Stalin would tell him about the values that he had as a man. You must be pure of heart. He frequently used Christian vernacular. He was also known, both from the children as well as his bodyguards and others, that he would tell them stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and was quite adamant Jesus was a man. He lived, he was righteous, and of his principles, and even speaking of his sacrifice. Now, these are not the words of somebody who rejected Christianity. There were several I found Georgian Bolsheviks who also spoke of him. And when he was younger, they actually, one of them said they would make a joke that he is the priest among us. But that continued through all of those years. And then I think the most extraordinary for me evidence of Stalin's, not just his background in Christianity, but I would say his practice of Christianity as a man happened not only during the war, but thereafter. There was a documentary back in the 1970s. It is fascinating to listen to. I think what was the name of that? It referenced the Kremlin, in the Kremlin. I think that may have been what it was called. But in this, one of his bodyguards discussed the small chapel, just like Vladimir Putin has a chapel in the Kremlin at his apartment there. Stalin also had, and this is completely private. This isn't something that, Stalin made something out of for any kind of, quote, political advantage, as those who want to deny his Christian faith. But he had his own chapel. And this bodyguard in the documentary talked about how often Stalin would enter it, stand before the icons of Holy Theotokos, the Mother of God, and of Jesus Christ, and stand there in silence. And he could only assume that he was either in deep thought or in prayer. But he wasn't the only one. The chief security officer, Vlasic, would say that frequently, when alone, Stalin would go into singing or humming hymns, or else into prayers. There were several other bodyguards that also have shared in their memoirs about Stalin's faith and practice of faith. Now, during the Great Patriotic War, World War II, he was known to frequently actually summon priests to the Kremlin. The NKVD archives that I have read have notations. They kept very good records. of the fact that he would have priests come to pray for and ask for prayers for the fallen during the war, and have blessings for the troops. And that's what he would want it, and even to pray with Stalin for the fallen troops. This also continued past the war. He would have priests come there for his private meeting in his chapel for prayer, and it can only be assumed perhaps, for the sacraments, but that was kept private. We do know that he did this. So to me, all of this points, there are, of course, other stories circulating kind of in a folklorish type of way during the war, as if he met Saint Matrona, a seer in Moscow, who predicted that the German fascists would be defeated, or that he had an icon of the Mother of God flown around Moscow during the siege of Moscow. But those we have less direct evidence for. But the very fact that such stories could exist and became popular shows you people were not afraid to express their faith. But for me as a historian, I've gone to the memoirs, the letters, Stalin's own correspondence, his children, those who worked at the Dacha also. And there are so many personal anecdotes of his expression of faith, his sharing of the Bible with others. And like I said, that personal prayer and singing of hymns. And interesting, I'll say this, he actually, other fellow either Orthodox or brought up Orthodox Bolsheviks that he knew of, he would frequently invite them to his dacha to sing hymns together. This went on for many years.
Well, I learned something. I didn't know most of that. But I just think, it's more evidence that those people who have this perception of, communism being in opposition to religion have a fundamental, misperception. But you were mentioning that, people don't have critical thinking skills. They don't know what socialism is. They don't know what communism is. They don't even know what capitalism is. They don't know their political up from their down. And, and again, I mean, all of that is by design, right? Because the ownership class, the ruling class, has no interest in a thoughtful, critical thinking, working class. So they do their very best to scramble people's minds, and they're very effective at it. But I want, my thoughts went to contemporary times and how, in socialist countries like in Nicaragua, there is a very tight connection and relationship between religion and communism, between the ideology and the religion. And even within the Catholic Church in Central and South America, I forget the name that these reformists, they were like reformist Catholics, but they were really on the side of the revolutionary governments in Central and South America that, Ronald Reagan, of course, waged a war against, training terrorists in the School of the Americas, Fort Benning, Georgia. I was stationed there. And those terrorists, they would shoot, they would assassinate these nuns and these clergy in Central and South America that were, on the side of the revolutionaries. Anyway, and so, there is, like you're talking about, there's this long objective relationship and good working together between religious folks and, in furtherance of socialism. And you still see that today, in Central and South America.
That's great examples. Exactly. And it just goes to what I'm saying. Anyone who is a communist, anyone who supported what was achieved in the Soviet Union, especially in, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, what we saw there, the strength that it made the Russia enduring in its strength that came from this socialism, communism. is to ignore this, what was right before them. The two have always been linked because ideally, although it hasn't been that way historically, Christianity, at least if you go right back to the teachings of Jesus, is about caring for the poor and the oppressed. And so I see absolutely no contradiction. Those are just people who have a narrative and a knee-jerk reaction, and want to ignore history, want to ignore the actual definitions. And what is our purpose? Ideally, as a Christian, you are doing what you were taught, to love one another. And as I said earlier, frankly, in all of history, I see nothing more loving than Stalin's government, and I see nothing more loving than what I'm seeing evinced in the Russian Federation right now. But when we go back to the communist time of Stalin, that was really all the principles that I believe in, that a good government should be evincing for its people. So there is absolutely no contradiction in the fact that there were so many high-ranking Bolsheviks who were also Orthodox. I remember a lot of anecdotes, actual written anecdotes of soldiers in their diaries that I read, of meeting with Stalin, and some of them, being afraid, because in those early years in the 20s, there had been so much, anti the church, and they were afraid even to carry their icons with them or to even visit. This was one of the most sad stories I read. He was very sad to visit his parents, who were practicing Christians. And Stalin always, we have so many anecdotes of encouraging you carry your icons with you, even to the point later in the war where the icons were given and just as they are now to the troops, and prayers were held. He always encouraged that. He actually was like, there is absolutely, and he said it himself one time, I'm paraphrasing though, there's absolutely no contradiction between us as communists and your parents and their faith. So, he had to be careful because, in those beginning years, it's not a Christian government. Nevertheless, unlike some, he was never anti-Christian. And I think that's what people are missing. And then later in the 30s and 40s and 50s, we see in my interpretation, certainly the Christian principles and values being evinced. And that is why I do believe he was a man of faith. This went far beyond lip service.
There's a very succinct quote that maybe you know better than I do, but it's something like, socialism is the politics of Christianity, or it's something very succinct. And it's like, socialism is just Christianity in action, or something like that. And I think,
exactly. Socialism is applied Christianity.
Yeah. And that is the most useful way to understand these things. And of course, that is, understanding it like that, the correct way, is, of course, not in the interest of the current ruling class that we have in the West. And so, they go to extraordinary lengths and invest tremendously in, getting people to misunderstand this reality, this very basic, simple reality. Christine, I think we've done such a great job on this topic, but go ahead. You have something else?
They use it divisively, as you alluded to earlier. And in the West, they use their quote Christianity, because I can only put it in quotation marks for many, not all, but I'm saying it is more used divisively as a political tool. And that's not what happens, for example, going modern in the Russian Federation, where Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam is respected. And this goes back to, I believe Lenin actually said that your religious belief or your faith, your spiritual aspects of your life are personal, and you have that respect for it. That's why there's not an attack on that per se. There was only, in the time of the Bolsheviks, an attack on those who were stealing and exploiting. It is in the West, there's just a complete misunderstanding. And I would just advise people, whether you're a communist, whether you're a Christian or atheist, get away from your narrative and instead focus upon what we share. and what we want. And if what we want, the few of us in the West who actually do believe in helping the poor and oppressed and see it as a battle between the classes, we're not going to let these things divide us. And nobody should be doing that. I know I'm digressing. I'm going to go back. It's a memory I had. All through his leadership years, Stalin sent money to nuns. He had a nuns monastery that he actually supported privately. This to me are the actions of a man who, like Lenin said, you keep your faith private because you're the head of a state, which in itself is non-religious. But privately, I believe that there is ample evidence, only a little bit of which I've shared with you today, that this was a man of faith. I wanted to share something with your audience. There was only one leader, Soviet leader, Stalin, that at his death, and I am a Russian Orthodox Christian, so this is very, very important, I would say significant, and it's brief, but at his death, he is the only one for whom the Russian Orthodox Church publicly prayed, and at the eulogy, the patriarch, who is the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, said, and I quote, our great leader and teacher, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, has departed from this life. A great moral and social force has ceased to exist. In him, our people recognized a leader whose genius penetrated deeply into the essence of events. As a man of genius, he revealed in every undertaking that which was hidden and inaccessible to the ordinary mind. His name will forever remain dear to our hearts, and the Russian Orthodox Church will never forget his benevolent attitude toward her needs. That was in 1953, and that is unprecedented for the church to be speaking of a Soviet leader that way.
No, I'm glad you remembered to share that with everyone. That's a great anecdote. I was kind of triggered by, how you said that, Christianity is a little bit manipulated and it's exploited in the West. And I wanted to concur with that and just talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Todd was wondering if you could somehow share a link to that quote in the chat. I'm not sure if you are that tech savvy. But Todd, we'll definitely get that on my Facebook
that
wall
afterwards.
Yeah, we'll get a link to that quote.
Todd, if you go to a good search engine, not a Western search engine usually, and simply put in patriarch, Russian Orthodox Church, Stalin eulogy, you will probably find it. If you go to Russian sites and archives, you can, of course, translate it.
Yeah. I'm sure. Yeah, it can't be that difficult to find with our modern technology.
No, it's
for
not.
sure. But we will share it too. So
thank you, Todd.
No, the exploitation of Christianity. And so I'm reminded of this doctrine. It's a relatively new doctrine. It started a couple hundred years ago. And it was with a particular translation. I think it was the Nelson Darby or sorry, yeah. I'm getting the name wrong. I wasn't really prepared to talk about this aspect of Christian doctrine in the West, but essentially it just says that this idea that the church, the believers in Christ have replaced the nation of Israel, and this is the whole point of the Old Testament was, God was working through the Israelite people, and then the New Testament is explaining how the people of God are transformed. They're no longer just a genetic, people, but they are the true Israelites are those people who believe in Christ. And so for, thousands of years, that was the accepted doctrine. And then a couple hundred years ago, mysteriously, it started becoming more and more popular to say that no, the Jewish people are actually still God's chosen people. And you know what? they're actually better than Christians, and you have a whole bunch of Christians, Christian Zionists who like really just they just love. They're a little bit self-loathing, but they just love the Jewish people, and they know that in 1949 the nation of Israel fulfilled Bible prophecy, and that God is wanting. He's a real estate agent, don't you know? God is a real estate agent, and he's he promised this little strip of land to the people who are Jewish, whatever that means, because half of the people in Israel are not religious, and of course there's not an ethnicity, because you've got Ethiopian Jews, Persian Jews, Eastern European Jews. I mean, it's so. But okay, so now we have religion. We have organized religion. Getting people to advocate and celebrate actual genocide. And so, like, if this isn't the biggest and greatest abomination that you can think of, like, it's just repugnant. And so what it does is it repulses normal people from religion. It makes Christianity disgusting to normal people. When you indoctrinate your believers into supporting such inhumanity and such evilness. So I think, unfortunately, this is the kind of religion that a socialist government is going to oppress, right? The socialist government is going to oppress those pastors who get rich lying to their masses into supporting genocide. Like, that is the kind of religion that ought to be repressed. And so I don't know, and that's the same kind of it's the same kind of the political religion that was repressed by the Soviet Union.
All right. I took a few notes as you were talking. Very interesting points, quite relevant to our discussion today, Billy Bob. I thank you for that. Since you brought it up, I'm going to share a few of my thoughts on this whole matter. Yes, Christianity, quote, Christianity, as you see in the West for the most part, is so far from what Jesus Christ taught, it is unrecognizable. As an Orthodox Christian myself, and as Orthodox Christians, we completely oppose this entire teaching. You were referring to that Darby Bible. That is where dispensationalism, the type of, quote, as you said, Christian Zionists come from. And whenever I hear the term Christian Zionist, I would say much more accurately, you should call them Christian Satanists, because they are doing the work of Satan to support this disgusting, evil Zionist state that I feel, as a Christian, I will speak spiritually, is fully controlled. Demonic people, Satan is controlling it, this genocide. And for anyone to think that they are a Christian as they support the murder of all of these innocent civilians, by their fruits you shall know them, and many will call upon my name, Jesus said, in the end times, and I will say, depart from me, because I never knew you. And that is what I think is going to happen, sadly, to the majority of Christians, except for those who choose to turn, as the Bible says, from their wicked ways. As for who are the God's chosen people, since you brought it up, I will share a little bit of my faith. God's chosen people upon Christ coming here. It's Christmas time. He became a human being like us, a God man. And by doing so, those who believe in him become God's chosen people. The New Testament is very clear about that. Those who follow God's will, not those who murder people. And as for the people who make up that Zionist state and the evil, because the vast majority do support what the IDF and what this government is doing, most of them, as you talked about, their ethnicity, this whole craziness about, quote, anti-Semitism. They're not even a Semitic people. Their backgrounds coming from, as you said, in Europe, Ashkenazi Jews made up of Turks and Mongols who accepted a, quote, religion, have no ethnicity. The ethnicity of the Semites are the Palestinians who are suffering at the hands of these demonic people. Those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's a very emotionally laden issue. Because it involves genocide and a history of persecution against Jewish people that is also real. Um, but yeah, I mean, it. I I wasn't really prepared to go into it, but you kind of triggered me when we talked about how religion in the United States, especially, and more so in Europe, is just being politicized and weaponized and exploited, to get people to support the state of Israel. And I know there's this big propaganda offensive. Like the state of Israel just invested billions, I want to say billions, into geofencing mega churches in the United States. And geofencing means that it's a geographic location on the church grounds. When you take your cell phone onto those church grounds, your cell phone will automatically spam you with ads and pro Israel propaganda. And so there's this major propaganda offensive underway, in billions being invested. It's probably just U.S. taxpayer money being recycled through Israel and coming back to these mega church owners. And it's these kinds of people, again, that just really give the religion a bad name. And so I'm with you. Those people are not representative of Christianity. I as an agnostic, I definitely see a tremendous value, and religion can be a great life-changing, bringing meaning to people's lives. And so, unfortunately, it's like everything in our lives. It is intentionally weaponized against us by the people, who don't want any kind of change or improvement, because they, things could not be any better for themselves. So Christine, help me out. Where are we gonna go from here?
Well,
I appreciate.
I'd like, since this is our Christmas edition, I'm very glad we were able to tackle a topic that I find divisive between Christians and communists alike, when there should be no divisiveness there. And at this time of year, this probably being our last show before Christmas time, whatever someone believes, I just want to share that we focus upon loving one another. What do all the great religions, what do all the great philosophies, what do even the scientific analysis of Marx and Lenin teach us, and Engels? What did Stalin express? It was all about love for the poor, and also educating them so that they will break free of the shackles. In the Bible, it says the truth will set you free. And I believe that. And at this time, wherever you're at on your spiritual path in life, love one another. And I see that for myself as an Orthodox Christian, but any Christian who's going to claim that name, you had better focus upon that, because that is what it all centers around. And for those who are not, and my communist brothers and sisters, what we share, what is it about? It is about love for the oppressed. It is about justice. That is what we share. That is what we should focus on at this time of the season and at year round. And again, as you and I very much elucidated, it's not about division. That's what the Western governments want you to do. It is about that which binds us together. And love for humanity is what binds us together. Be you communist, be you Christian, be you agnostic. And even for those, whatever their understanding or lack thereof, whatever they feel, whether there's a divine being or not, if you're listening to Billy Bob and I, you must be a Marxist-Leninist, or at least very interested in reading these theories. And it fundamentally gets down to love for mankind. And I've never seen that better evinced than what Marx and Lenin taught us.
No, that's a great point, and it's a great place to end on. I mean, it's easy to get angry and divisive, when we're on social media, when we're, talking to people who are really frustrating. But like we only have so long on the earth, and if I just imagine, when our time is really short, one thing we won't be regretting is any time we spent loving, right? Like that's going to be our greatest legacy. And so it's tough, and it's it can be very challenging to keep a proper perspective. But in the grand scheme of things, it's all about love. And like you said, socialism is the politics of love, and Christianity is the religion of love. And that's not to exclude other religions, because like Todd was saying, Buddhism and Islam, the core of these religions are also love. So that's the whole point of everything. And it is a great place to end, as we are just less than a week away from Christmas. So thank you, Christine, so much. We will return. Me and you are doing it every other Friday episode. So thank you so much for this topic and for your expertise. I can't wait to see what you have in store for the Friday after next. Anything else you wanted to say?
I just want to say a blessed Christmas to everyone. And it was really good for us to do this show, to show the parallels between these beliefs, one from scientific theory and observation, and one from who I believe, Jesus Christ, the greatest spiritual teacher. Both complement one another, and just blessings to all. And it was a pleasure to be with you again, Billy Bob.
It's my honor. I'm so thankful that you enjoy every other Friday episode with me. So let's do it again, and we will see everyone the Friday after next. Thank you so much.